This week we're dealing with the general epistles. That's Hebrews, James, 1st and 2nd Peter, 1st and 2nd, 3rd John, and Jude. Here you have a mosaic of Peter being crucified there on the left, upside down, as tradition holds. In the middle, you have a piece of papyrus from P46, and the earliest grouping of Paul's letters, and Hebrews is including in that, and that's like the Hebrews, the first verses of Hebrews. And then to the right, you have an icon of St. Jude from the shortest of these letters. Well, 2nd and 3rd John's pretty short too, but that's what these pictures are. The general epistles are real interesting because they're really kind of shoved at the end of the New Testament. They're also known as Catholic epistles or universal epistles, and it's basically the ones that don't fit anywhere else. You have the Gospels, which are their own kind of genre. You have the Acts of the Apostles, it's its own thing. Then you have the Pauline epistles that go from Romans all the way to Philemon. And then you have this section of epistles just before the Revelation that's considered general epistles. In the general epistles, each one or group address incredibly different issues. The reason they're general or universal or Catholic, and Catholic here is the lowercase Catholic, meaning universal. They really don't have much to do with each other, to be honest with you, outside of being grouped as the rest of them, basically. So what James addresses is fundamentally different than 1st John, etc. I will talk about the Johannine epistles. These are the 3 letters attributed to John, known as the Johannine epistles. That's 1st, 2nd, 3rd John. And similar to the Pauline epistles, those are all the letters that are attributed to Paul, whether that's by Paul or not. And then the 2 letters attributed to Peter are called the Petrine epistles. So when you hear me say Johannine or Petrine, just know that that's these epistles that are attributed to John and Peter. So this is just an overview, by the way, to give you an idea of what's happening this week as we deal with the general epistles. The letter to the Hebrews is really deals with the tradition. And I think Hebrews reinterprets the Jewish tradition in light of Jesus Christ. And I think it was written after the destruction of the temple. Most scholars agree with that. And it's a Christological interpretation of what happens when all the things that you've always known are gone. So we'll talk about Hebrews with very specific terms in the next lecture, but I just wanted you to know that, to give you an idea of what these general epistles are dealing with. So Hebrews deals specifically with the priesthood and the sacrificial system, or the cult, the temple cult. Rome destroyed that completely in 70 and dismantled the priesthood. And at that time, the priesthood was really picked by the Roman government anyway. So Hebrews interprets all that, the destruction of the temple, in light of Jesus. So without a temple, Jesus is the priesthood. Without this priest to do sacrificial offerings, Jesus becomes the sacrifice. So Hebrews reinterprets the tradition after the destruction of the temple. And then we come to the letter of James. We've already dealt with the letter of James in particular, so we won't spend hardly any time with it here. It's arguably one of the earliest writings in the New Testament, and the whole point of it is constructing identity based on the teachings of Jesus that's still thoroughly Jewish in nature. And that identity is a nativist reaction to Roman imperialism. So, remain unstained by the world. I think the world is exactly the Roman world. And those who kind of jump in and try to navigate that space between the Roman imperialism and the Jesus movement and have more of a hybrid understanding of Christian identity, or early Jewish Christian identity, I think James confronts that as well, this idea of friendship with the world as being untenable. So we already studied that. So that's the nature of the letter of James. Moving to the epistles of Peter are real interesting. Here, that Greek inscription is martyron. Let's see, martyrion. So that means the martyr or the witness. Agia, of Saint Patras, Peter. So this literally says the martyrdom of Saint Peter. And this is a mosaic from an early church. Here, the Petrine epistles are really interesting. It really is a second generation, if not third generation, understanding of Christianity. So these are not written by Peter, but they do. First Peter deals with persecution in particular, and as you can see here, that's what I'm trying to capture by using this mosaic in a church. What happens when persecution breaks out, and the persecution here is fundamentally different than the kind of opposition that Paul faced in the early Jesus movement. The early Jesus movement was a Jewish movement, and some of the earliest conflicts deal specifically with its Jewishness and incorporating Gentiles. It really didn't have much to do with none of these early Christian writings had much to do with how to interact with polytheism outside of converting polytheist Gentiles into the monotheistic religion that claimed Christ as Messiah. So later on, however, as Christianity or as this early Jesus movement grows, it does begin to have run-ins with pagan culture that are conflicts. And I think First Peter deals specifically with some of those conflicts and some of the local persecutions that started breaking out later in the first century. But Second Peter is fundamentally different, and it has a lot more similarities with Jude than First Peter. So while it's attributed, the reason First Peter and Second Peter are classified as First Peter and Second Peter is because they are both attributed to Peter, and First Peter is longer than Second Peter. It's the same way in First, Second, Third John, but we'll get to that a little bit. So the reason these two Petrine epistles are grouped together is because it says that both letters say that they're written by Peter, although Second Peter and Jude are remarkably similar. Moving to the Johannine epistles, I'm going to probably spend more time on these epistles when we get to the Gospel of John, because they are in the Johannine tradition. The Gospel of John and the first, second, and third John are all within the same school, the Johannine school or the Johannine community. So we'll try to get to these a little bit, but we're probably going to do this in more depth later on when we get to the Gospel of John. But these are much later, and that's why I'm kind of having a conflict here by doing them in the general epistles, because they're so much later, and they are a reaction to the Gospel of Jesus, the Gospel of John. So the Gospel of John, it seems like the Gospel of John itself goes a little too far in the way it understands Jesus from a divinity standpoint. Or at least people who read the Gospel of John really went too far in that direction and started doubting the humanity of Jesus. And the Johannine epistles confront that Christology that's gone a little bit too far. Just the fact that we're talking about Christology, the conception of Jesus as divine and human, shows that this is a much later argument. That is not an argument in the early Jewish movement. Just never was. So here you got an icon of John on the far left from Greece, ancient Greek icon. In the middle, this is an Ethiopian icon, and the letter that John is holding there is written in Ge'ez or Amharic script. So it shows you that it's fascinating to me. And El Greco he painted this of John when he was younger. Well, this is the idea that when John was young, that El Greco is a medieval painter, Renaissance painter. So there you have the Johannine epistles. Moving right along to Jude. This is an icon of Saint Jude. It's fascinating because the Greek word itself is Judas, and we translate Judas as Jude into English mainly because Judas, we don't want to be confused with the Judas who betrayed Jesus, but also because Judas is such a bad character in early Christianity. So we translated Jude to kind of for those two reasons. Jude deals primarily with false teachers. It's a very short letter and it's very similar to Second Peter. So those are the general epistles. They're grouped together because they don't fit anywhere else, to be honest with you, and that's how the early Christianity, as the canon was being put together, that's how they did it. Literally, the gospel, the letters of Paul, undisputed letters of Paul, at the time in early Christianity, they're grouped from Romans, First Corinthians, Second Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, because it goes from largest to smallest. And then even in early Christianity, First and Second Timothy and Titus came in late, so they kind of stuck those at the end. But that's how all these things are done with these letters. So Hebrews is the largest, James is second largest, that kind of thing. So the content of each of these each letter and each group of letters is wildly different, as you can already see. It's placed at the end of the New Testament, with the exception only of the Revelation. The Revelation is one of the last books of the New Testament to be included in the canon, and it literally stuck in last because of that. And then they're placed in that position primarily due to the relative importance of the of their relative importance to Gospels, Acts, Paul, and the Pauline epistles. So, as the New Testament was being put together, these early, leaders of the early Christian movement understood that the Gospels and Acts were the most important. Pauline letters were the second most important. The general epistles kind of fall in that category, and the Revelation is at the end. So these are the general epistles. I hope this short lecture gives you a broad understanding of where they are in the canon and kind of the general theme of what each one of them is like. The next lecture we'll deal with the letter of Hebrews in particular, and then look at Peter's epistles, the Petrine epistles, and then Jude.